Okay. I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal Wangal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of this land. I pay my respects to their elders past and present and acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Shawna Tang. I work at Gender and Cultural Studies at the University of Sydney, where I teach and research at the nexus of race, gender, and sexuality. I am from Singapore and now a runner-up settler in Gadigal Wangal land. Right? So I'm very thrilled to be here this evening to converse with Alana and to be in the company of this radical panel discussing Alana's new book, The New Racial Regime, Recalibrations of White Supremacy. On our panel today is, of course, Alana Lentin, professor at Western Sydney University. She is Jewish and anti-Zionist teacher and writer who is a settler on Gadigal Wangal land. She is also the author of Why Race Still Matters, published by Polity in 2020, among a lot of other writing on race and anti-racism. Keiran Stewart-Assheton is a proud Australian man from the occupied Yuin Nation. He is a community leader and revolutionary theorist with over 15 years of organizing experience. He is the founding president of the Black People's Union and a radio show host who uses his platform to amplify First Nation voices and connect local struggles to global movements. And then we have Kaiya Aboagye, who is an Afro-Indigenous writer and scholar in the School of Social Sciences at the University of Western Sydney. Her PhD research examines the entangled histories of African diasporic and Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people within the framework of Indigenous sovereignty. Before we begin this discussion, I'm going to exercise my chair privilege to offer a few opening remarks and share my experience reading the book. I will then pose some framing questions to Alana, and that will guide our panel conversations later, right? And then we'll open it up to the audience for discussion. So this is how the evening will proceed. So first of all, congratulations, Alana, on writing. On writing The New Racial Regime, Recalibrations of White Supremacy. The book is making its rounds internationally, and understandably so. It is breathtaking in its theoretical insight and brilliance. And also, it literally left me quite breathless at the sheer scale and expanse of the research. Let me explain. The brilliance of the book lies in how it takes Cedric Robinson's concept of the racial regime, illuminates it, and recalibrates it for our contemporary moment, giving us a vital theoretical tool to analyze and navigate the workings of race, or more plainly, white supremacy, which affects every one of us in so far as we are living under the conditions of Western modernity, though, of course, negatively racialized populations bear the cost of white supremacy far more disproportionately. The book, as the title suggests, is about this thing called the racial regime, a concept developed by the Black radical thinker Cedric Robinson in his 2007 book, Forgeries of Memory and Meaning. The idea of the racial regime follows from Robinson's earlier and more widely known concept, racial capitalism, first elaborated in Black Marxism in 1983. Right? So together, these ideas emerged out of a Black radical tradition, an organic, collective, intellectual and political project of survival and standing against the barbarism of Western civilization. Reflecting on how the Black radical tradition developed, Robinson writes in Black Marxism that, quote, it has not been conscious of itself as a tradition. There have been no sacred texts, there have been no authoritative intellects or leaders, and there have been partial comprehensions. Alana's book, along with all the other work she has done, stands as a key interlocutor of the Black radical tradition, and especially of Cedric Robinson, in ways that are frankly unparalleled in this part of the world. And this book has been, for me, tremendously instructive. As a wannabe serious scholar, I've sat in classrooms with my students and in study groups with my partner Yiling. And one thing that always comes up when you immerse yourself in Robinson's work is just how demanding, even daunting the text can be. Right? Shout out to my students who are here, and of course to Yiling. Right? We have all tried to wrestle with racial capitalism, Robinson's more influential concept. Now, one of the gifts of Alana's book is, and there are many, right, is that it engages with utmost clarity Robinson's racial capitalism, right, a concept that has been misread, reduced, dismissed, including by some prominent Marxist scholars who insist on a purely class analysis, treating race as nothing more than distracting identity politics. Right? In this book, Alana confronts these questions head on, so it's quite juicy. But it also offers a rigorously clarifying account of racial capitalism, and then connects it to Robinson's idea of the racial regime within the lineage of the Black radical tradition. She is a true interlocutor. Alana also reveals in this book that for Robinson himself, right, to him, what's more important than racial capitalism is the concept of the racial regime. Right? For those of us who have been obsessively working through racial capitalism, that insight is mind-blowing. It sort of took my breath away, left me gasping, thinking, "Wow, this is there's just so much more to learn, Shawna. You need to keep up." And it is hard to catch a breath reading this book with its many revelations and insights. The racial regime is the book's central theoretical contribution, and I'll invite Alana to tell us more about it in a moment. But I'll just have to say this, right? In tracking how the racial regime works, the book is breathtakingly global in its reach. I was struck by how Alana writes that she had to, quote, try to keep track of the interactions between ostensibly disparate locations and interconnected dynamics, unquote. And that, quote, the experience of tracking the racial regime inevitably means becoming entrapped in its web, unquote. And what a web it is, right? One that weaves together the war on critical race theory in the US, politicians in the UK doing their usual hackery about how imperialism and colonialism is not always a bad thing, right? The moral exceptionalism in Germany that willfully conflates anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, the entanglement of Zionism with indigenous politics here in Australia, and of course Israel's ongoing occupation and genocide in Gaza. Right? So the book was doing history, but not as a straight line, right, to quote a phrase from Alana's book, but as a web of relational histories in the current conjuncture of the new racial regime. By the end, like I say, I was left quite breathless, not just from how the book is tracking lateral developments around the world, but also from the sheer range of sources Alana draws on, right? A deleted tweet by the Israeli government, shady reports produced by right-wing think tanks, discredited ancestry studies naturalizing Zionist occupation, photographs in German newspapers shaming allegedly anti-Semitic intellectuals, Elon Musk's Nazi salutes, prison recruitment ads in Queensland, and the avalanche of conservative anti-woke posts on X. So it was just immense, right? And every trace becomes part of the web that Alana so deftly brings together and exposes as the operation of the racial regime. It's such meticulous scholarship that there's even a spreadsheet that Alana writes about, populated with, quote, all sorts of tidbits from the UK outrage orbit, crowdsourced by a global community of anti-racist scholars. Nothing, it seems, is too small or inconsequential, and Alana somehow keeps up with them all, right? At a pace that at times feels like real-time analysis, which is a remarkable achievement for an academic book. It is a sole-authored book, yet a chorus of thinkers animate the work throughout, a testament to Alana's very admirable citational practice and commitment to collective intellectual work. Hers is a methodology as tireless as the racial regime itself. On this note, I'd like us to sort of again congratulate Alana on her book. To start our conversation now, I would like to invite Alana to tell us a bit more about the book, its background, the questions that drive it, and of course, tell us what is the racial regime.
Wow, thank you very much, Shawna. First, let me start by acknowledging that we're on stolen, unceded Gadigal-Wangal land, and allow me to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to thank all Aboriginal people who are here with us today, in particular my interlocutors, Kaiya, Aboagye, and Keiran, Stewart-Assheton, who are here. I really couldn't have wished for a better panel, and I selected you very carefully because I was convinced that this is the most radical panel that I can assemble in so-called Australia. And I think I'm right. I think you're going to have a treat listening not only to Shawna's amazing introduction, which, I mean, frankly, I think you explained the book better than I can myself. I feel a little bit, and as I said to them earlier, I actually lost half my notes this morning, so forgive me if I'm a little bit off the cuff. But I'd also like to acknowledge, of course, the day that's in it. On a more serious, well, it was a serious note before, but we're still in a particularly serious note. Of course, Tufan al-Aqsa yesterday, the resistance, the everlasting resistance of the Palestinian people. I opened the book by citing Bassel al-Araj, who said, you want to be an intellectual, then you must resist, otherwise you and your education are useless. And I tried to live by that. And I think we are all inspired, many of us here are inspired by the rising up and the breaching of the fence of the Gaza ghetto. But of course today is the 8th of October and the beginning of this phase of the Zionist entity's genocide on the Palestinian people of Gaza, which they're currently still struggling, of course, against. And many of us, and thank you, those of you, you know who you are, who are here, Sophia, for example, raising funds for our friends in Gaza. And this, I'm really happy that this evening we raised $1,000, which is going to be shared between the family that I have been supporting since last year, the Al-Aqra family in Deir al-Balah, and also Mob Strong General Fund. And everybody has a leaflet. There's some leaflets around for Mob Strong, so if you'd like to donate to them, you know, most of you already have, or take it away with you and try to set up a regular donation to Mob here, that would be fantastic. I also want to thank Ross Goodman-Brown for being the person who instigated this event, because I think without you, I wouldn't have done it, because I didn't really want to do a book launch, but you convinced me to do it, and opening up the space here at Frontyard. Of course, I'd like to thank my family who are here today, Partho, who's filming, and my mother, Ronit, Comrade Mummy, I've decided she's called, and Noam, who's in the back, who's going to be selling the books later on. I also need to thank the School of Humanities and Communication Arts, who did give us some money for the food, which is very nice of them. Yes, and also I want to thank, of course, Cedric Robinson, Presente, and Elizabeth Robinson, Cedric's longtime wife, who very graciously wrote the foreword to the book. I was really overwhelmed that she agreed to write it, and thrilled with the words that she shared with us. And of course, people who endorsed the book, Dylan Rodriguez, Charisse Burden-Stelly, Stephen Salaita, Ali Megji, HLT Kwan, and Huria Boutelja, all of whom have been an amazing influence on me. But also, as you mentioned, I think it's really important to talk about the collective nature of writing this book. So I found this book really, really difficult to write, and it took me quite a long time. And I have a chat of people who do this similar kind of work, and I didn't receive any research funding to do any kind of work. So I asked them, as you said, you mentioned the spreadsheet, so I just asked people if they could just put bits and pieces into this Google spreadsheet that I then used to kind of, you know, mine for examples and so on. And I think, you know, this is something that a lot of us have been thinking about, the importance of citational practice. There is no such thing as new knowledge. There's only different ways of looking at it. And so what I've really tried to do, and I hope if I've made any mistakes, you know, please correct me, but I've tried to really give credit where it's due to all of the multiple conversations that I've had A lot of the thinking, you mentioned the link between indigeneity, or the use of indigeneity and Zionism, the specious use of indigeneity by Zionists. I wouldn't have been able to do that without your work, Keiran. Conversations that you had, but also conversations that I was made privy to, and I really thank you all for that. Before I move on to your question, I also want to say something that's really inspired me. So one of the people who really helped me to understand Cedric Robinson is his biographer, the Black radical scholar Joshua Myers. And he's written the biography of Cedric Robinson and also of Black Study, which is an amazing book which has inspired me a lot. And at a particularly low time, I was listening to an interview that he gave with my favorite podcast, Millennials Are Killing Capitalism, that's also widely cited throughout the book. And he said, and this is a quote from Josh, he said, "I've come to the conclusion that if you are a Black academic or a radical academic or claim to be radical, and your university or some other powerful entity isn't actively moving against you, I've got to be suspicious of you now." That's where we are right now in terms of the repression. So anybody that's out there just freely moving around, nobody's threatening them, that tells you about their character and also tells you about their commitment. All right, so this brings me to why write this book. So Josh spoke about the repression, and I think that's what I was noting. So you mentioned my last book, Why Race Still Matters. It came out in 2020. We don't think about it very often, but of course it was during COVID lockdown. The book came out. And very quickly after that, we started hearing this idea that critical race theory was causing everything to go to hell in a handcart. And I was like, that's so weird, right? Because critical race theory is such a niche thing. And particularly when you had, if you remember, Pauline Hanson tried to move a motion in the Senate against critical race theory. And you're thinking, we barely can talk about race in any school or university in Australia. So why are we even talking about banning critical race theory? And she does this interview that I mentioned in the book with Alan Jones, that old paedophile, and she says, and they've done it in the US, they've banned it in all these states, and I'm trying to get them to do it here, and nobody were listening to me. And we're like, well, of course, But she did manage to pass that other, briefly pass that other motion, it's wrong to be white. So it all kind of dovetails with each other. So I thought I would do a short, maybe essay-like book, because I was quite exhausted after the last book, and I was like, I don't really feel like doing a big thing. Let me write a short essay about what is this war on critical race theory all about. And I recounted in the preface. It was quite interesting because, I eventually wrote it for Pluto. I started the conversation with them, and not to get bogged down in the details, but I went to another publisher at a certain point, and they said to me, but surely this will all have blown over in a year's time. Nobody's going to be talking about this in a year's time. By the time you finish the book and it comes out, and I was like, you obviously know nothing about the politics of race. Anyway, luckily, Pluto did decide to come on board, and it was around the time that I was starting to write the book and thinking about how to frame it, and starting to engage with Cedric Robinson, and particularly his 2007 book, Forgeries of Memory and Meaning, in which he tells us about this idea. And it's both a concept and a methodology, the racial regime. I heard an interview with Robin D.G. Kelley, so the Black radical historian, who was actually a student of, he wasn't directly Robinson's student, but he went to him when he was a student, I think at Berkeley, and said, you have to help me, because he had read Black Marxism, but in the 80s, hardly anybody was reading at the time, because it was actually published by Zed Books in Britain, and people in the US didn't read it because who the hell are the Brits, right? We don't engage with them. So only a few people were reading it. So Kelley, having read Black Marxism, went to Cedric and said, please help me, basically. And ever since then, he's been one of Cedric Robinson's main interlocutors. So he gave this interview in, I think, 2022, and he said, and I opened the book with this, that anti-wokeness is the perfect example of the functioning of the racial regime. And I thought, well, that's lucky, because that's what I think as well. And it's good that I have endorsement from Robin Kelley. So the racial regime, as you've said, is from this book, Forgeries of Memory and Meaning. And actually this book so Robinson died in 2016, and this book came out in 2007, and it's his last book, but it apparently took him 20 years to research. It's a massive, massive book. And it's a book about the racialization of black people in and through the US American film industry. And the book uses film and capitalism as filters for writing black history. And this is, if you know, for example, the H.L.T. Kwan edited volume of Robinson's writings, you'll see that film and popular culture are a massive thing for him. So he's really engaging, particularly in the 1990s, very similarly to Stuart Hall. Not in a similar way necessarily, but they have similar interests at similar times, very interestingly. He's engaging a lot with media and film. Particularly, there's a brilliant essay on blaxploitation in that collection, and there are essays on all kinds of black filmmakers. And so he was very particularly interested in this. And he writes that the book traces a fractious and contested racial regime which emerges at the end of the 19th century with the development of finance capital to determine the shape of race in the 20th century. So this is a time in US history where he says a new racial regime was being stitched from old cloth and new. And what he meant was that there was a racial regime, but with the sort of the way he puts it is that there's the entire kind of the achievement, not in a good way, of the colonization of Turtle Island. And this is the point at which the US puts itself out as an imperial power. So it starts to look for territories outside of these borders. And at this time, they have to mobilize a particular vision of blackness, which is tethered to that project of the particular form taken by racial capitalism at this time and imperialism leading to the US becoming this global the sort of imperialist power that we know it to be today. And so he does a lot of analysis, for example, of the jungle movie genre or the Western, and how these are used to kind of shore up this idea of this brave, white, frontier man, sort of, putting down the natives, be it on Turtle Island itself or in the new kind of colonial entities of, Haiti, Puerto Rico, etc. And so for this reason, you had to kind of portray black people in a very particular way, and it changes, and he's trying to note how it changes alongside the needs at the same time for the US to become a nation state and to gather immigrants around this idea of whiteness that was cohering at this time. So before this, you didn't really have a locked in, like the people who were immigrants to the United States were not thought of as white. This is how you bring them into this white imperial project by endowing them with whiteness and setting them up against, obviously, indigenous people and black people. And of course, we have our own version of that here, to great tragic effects. So the concept and methodology of the racial regime provides for us a way to think about the functioning of race, which, as Stuart Hall said, is always slipping around the edge of the veranda and climbing back in through the pantry window. So it's this slippery object, and this is what the racial regime tries to track. And one of the things that's very particular about the way, and I think really overturns so much of the ideas that we have about race, because of course race, the idea of it, tries to naturalize and fix differences among human beings. But actually the construction of race historically over time is extremely chaotic. And it's extremely chaotic because it's constantly responding to resistance from below. So it's always in this tension between the attempt to establish hegemony and dominance and resistance that's going to come from below. So the definition that Robinson gives of the racial regime is, he calls them constructed social systems in which race is proposed as the justification for relations of power. And he says that the racial regime's covering conceit, he uses this word conceit a lot, is a makeshift pattern masquerading as memory and the immutable. A key feature of racial regimes, as the book's title says, is that they are constantly recalibrated, never completely new, but restitched from old cloth, as I said. I was going to read a few things here, but I don't know if you want me to pause or do you want me to go on?
I think I think go on.
Yeah, okay, fine. Okay, so just a few more things about how we talk about racial regimes. So the racial regime, Robinson says, is made up of representational mythologies that tend to throw us off course because it is their function to do so. These mythologies are constantly recalibrated, as I said, in response to attack from below. When, as Robin Kelley puts it in that interview I mentioned earlier, you're running for your life, you're trying to create a mythology to make it seem like, you know, the emperor actually does have clothes when really he doesn't. And Josh Myers says, the racial regime is this nimble force that continuously recapitulates the idea that Africans have to be controlled, maintained, have to be disciplined through representation. And that's so interesting because I think what we have in this concept of the racial regime is that we shouldn't separate between the level of representation and the level of structure. So if we think, you know, scholars of Robinson's, for example, Yusuf al-Baluchi, who I quote in the book, says, you can't really understand racial capitalism without understanding the racial regime, because the two go together. You need this realm of representation and myth-making in order for the structure of race to be to persist and to be perpetuated. So we tend to think of each moment in the recalibration of the racial regime as new, but Robinson was already observing many of the same things that we see today, writing in the 1990s, when he wrote of the current controversy, this is in the 90s, of anti-post multiculturalism, which resulted in a campaign of deterrence and containment against the democratization and radicalization of knowledge. So obviously speed up to 2025, and the last few years we've got bans on books, bans on African and Black studies, obviously the war on critical race theory, and indeed the humanities in general, as we're seeing today. But part of what I do in the book is to resist this notion that this is all a kind of a plot to nix public education or to get rid of the humanities and arts. What I'm interested in is, why is it always race, right? Why is race always their problem? Or how do these generalized attacks always work through race? Because of course, you mentioned kind of classical Marxism, liberalism also, we tend to put race to the side and think that it's not the central contradiction, it's maybe a secondary or a tertiary contradiction, whereas I'm going to say with Robinson and throughout my work that this is the primary contradiction. So to think about how the racial regime is recalibrated, we also have to think about how things are relational, and this you mentioned also. Robinson used what he calls the materials of the Black radical tradition to think about how processes of race-making from different locations, as you said, are part of a set of world historical processes which he saw as originating, as we know, from Black Marxism in feudal Europe. And for example, with Elizabeth, he wrote in 2016, let me find it, they wrote together, the last piece that Cedric and I wrote, this is from the foreword that Elizabeth wrote, focused on Ferguson, Missouri, and the killing of Michael Brown at the hands of Ferguson police. Regardless of the exact circumstances of Brown's death of Black people through official violence was and is a near daily occurrence. Palestinians who expressed solidarity with the Black community in Ferguson did so out of a sense of solidarity, even before genocide began to unfold in Gaza and beyond. So they were already talking about the links between the Black American experience and the Palestinian and Indigenous experience. Yes, I think I'll probably leave it there for now.
Can I just comment on two things that you have said before we move on to the panel discussion? And the first thing that I sort of want to note is that, so you say that each recalibration of the racial regime is not new, right? So the war on critical race theory must be thought of relationally with other kinds of recalibrations, right? And these recalibrations, of the racial regime, they just sort of keep coming, right? As you note in the book, the attack on critical race theory then morphed into an attack on woke and then on gender ideology, affecting trans and gender diverse people, which is how the racial regime operates relationally, right? On different scales and affecting everyone, right? Not just the negatively racialized. And also I was also very struck by how the ways in which you talk about the racial regime and how it is to me quite sort of endlessly promiscuous, right? In how it conjoins even the strangest bedfellows, right? Like in France, the anti-Semitic far right under Marine Le Pen and the Zionists, or between segments of Australia's Indigenous community and Zionist colonizers. And in the US, there are so many recalibrations in history that you sort of don't even know where to start, right? Bill Clinton and the dismantling of welfare, George Bush and the war on terror, the deporter-in-chief Barack Obama, who is only sort of being outdone by Trump now, and let's not forget the genocidal denialist Joe Biden, right? So the racial regime helps us to read these developments as relational, right? Not individually or isolated, but as interconnected and moving in ways across history, right, and across geographies, which is why the expanse of your book is just incredibly global, right? And you write, referencing Geraldine Hing, who, by the way, is Singaporean.
Yes.
I don't know what to raise that. It's not as if I'm patriotic. But you write, referencing Geraldine Hing, that, quote, in fact, multiple temporalities are at play at different times and in different contexts, and that being alive to that fact, that modern manifestation of race build on or rehabilitate those of the past, allows us to trace their genealogies more closely with the aim of deepening understanding and opening new routes to anti-racist consciousness, unquote. Right? And so the racial regime as an analytic does raise consciousness for political work, and how then in thinking with it we are forced to think relationally across history and across geographies. And so much of the book is itself a call for that anti-racist resistance work to be done against white supremacy. Let me check for time. Yeah, maybe we can go on to the panel discussion, because on this note of sort of the book urging us to engage in anti-racist resistance work, I'd like to ask the panel, and maybe we can start with Keiran and then Kaiya. Could you perhaps tell us about the organizing work you do, right? And then thinking with the racial regime, how do you see your organizing or politics as getting co-opted or somehow recalibrated, and what sort of political frustrations you have encountered in the work you do?
Yeah. So hello everyone, my name is Keiran Stewart-Assheton. I'm the founding president of the BPU, as you heard before. I also do a lot of work with a lot of First Nations communities right across the continent, helping to empower them towards self-determination and empower their sovereignty, empower them to do things like take bits of land back. One of the really great examples is down in Melbourne, where we've taken a bit of land back in what was formerly known as the King's Domain. We're now calling it Camp Sovereignty. But we're using that as a spot to practice cultural healing and as a gathering spot to, discuss politics and education and all that sort of stuff. Do a whole bunch of other work as well on the, I don't want to use this term, but like on the left-wing sort of scene. Like in amongst unions and stuff like that. Like the BPU is also a trade union, so we do quite a lot of industrial representation for mob who experience all sorts of racism and other things within their workplaces. And what else? I do a whole bunch of other stuff as well, like education stuff, and make zines and educational resources and whatever have you. Essentially, like what we do in the BPU is we're just there to fill all the gaps that exist with the current trade union movement, and all the gaps that are left by these NGOs and all of these other, again, hate the term, but left-wing groups, like your different Marxist and anarchist collectives and whatever have you. So yeah, we do a lot of work just helping out mob, I suppose, trying to fight for our land back, fight for our sovereignty, and fight for our self-determination. And what was the question? The political frustration?
Yeah, political frustrations. Yeah.
So this could be a whole panel in itself, but I'll try and keep it short. I suppose like the main sort of frustrations we come up against, I'll just list them off with a little quick explainer. One of them is liberalism, of course. Liberalism's a political ideology that is very, to paraphrase Lesotho, it's very persuasive in our society. It exists everywhere. It's, our government structures, it's our institutions, it's the way that we relate to each other and interact with each other. It's also quite prominent on the left, even though most of your Marxists and anarchists and whatever else they want to call themselves might try and distance themselves from liberalism. At the end of the day, they still all practice liberalism in many forms. So liberalism is probably like one of the number one things that we come up against. Another thing, but I believe there's a question about this later, so I'll get to that a bit later, is the whole co-option of our struggle. Really great example that happened recently was the Voice to Parliament. In particular, the way that it was very much framed as, self-determination and sovereignty and all of these other words that sound great on paper, but it wasn't actually what it was. Had nothing to do with that. Self-determination is not a powerless advisory body. Self-determination is actually having the power to determine your own politics, which the Voice never was. So we come up against quite a lot of co-option of our terms and of our slogans and of our resistance and our movements. Also of like indigeneity, which again is a question a bit later, I believe, so I'll cover that a bit later. But yeah, we come up a lot against that, and also just a lot of capture within our community. The proper terms are compradors and elite capture, but we have so many First Nations people who have taken up prominent platforms but essentially push the will of the colony. They don't actually push for disruption of the colony. They don't push for a redistribution of power back to First Nations people and communities. Instead, they are just anyone heard of Uncle Robbie Thorpe? He's a legend. So Uncle Robbie Thorpe calls them tokenuts at the end of the day. And, that's exactly what they are. They're token black faces within these progressive spaces that are just there to sign off on more colonial BS and not actually do anything to help mob. So that's something that we come up quite a lot against in the frustrations that we experience organising. That, and the other real big thing is racism, of course, which is perfect for this panel. But when I talk about racism, I'm not talking about your far-right racists, I'm not talking about your overt racists, I'm talking about your covert racists. Australia has a massive problem with covert racism. The left in particular, the left is full of settlers who take on a very colonial chauvinist outlook in the way that they organise and the way that they relate to Indigenous communities. And they push a lot of, racist paternalism at the end of the day. They believe that they have the answer to the issues that we face in our communities, even though they're the ones that brought the issues into our communities and continue to perpetuate them. So, I'd say they're probably like the biggest frustrations. Liberalism, co-option, and racist, paternalistic racism.
Hi everyone. So I'm just going to locate myself. I'm an Afro-Indigenous person. My lineages connect me to Arab Island in the Torres Straits, also Membra and Kuki-Yalanji. They're places in far north Queensland, for those of you that don't know. I also have connections to my great-great-grandfather was blackbirded through the blackbirding trade and trafficking of Melanesian peoples. My father is from Ghana, West Africa. And so these are the intersections in which I write, speak, and think from. And I also want to acknowledge the sacred sovereignty of this place and the continued fight for freedom here in Sydney. So the question around political frustration, so I think when I was planning around, doing my thinking around this question, I was thinking about the context that we're in. And, one of the things with the genocide and the revolutionary struggles of the Palestinian liberation movement is producing like an increased public awareness or increased language around fascism or, an understanding about how this actually operates through the hegemonic Western power structure. So there's like an increasing awareness around an anti-colonial consciousness or a resistant understanding about the third world resistance movements globally. And I think like something that your book does that's really important is talks about this idea of the longue durée of colonialism and slavery, which is a really important way of speaking to these long kind of historicising processes that allow us to bring in a more global dimension into our analysis. And I can see that kind of slowly entering into the public space at the moment in a way that perhaps we haven't seen as much before. So with this increasing kind of anti-colonial consciousness that we're seeing in the public space, we're seeing an increasing rise in like our understanding of theory and practice and how that informs our thinking around movements and mobilising freedom movements. So this kind of like racial literacy has been a big problem for white Australia and Australia as a nation state in general, and I think you've done also a lot of work in the past around the racial literacy and the lack of the advanced, well, you know, the need to advance our racial literacy in Australia here, and moving that. So seeing that kind of move into the public discourses, you know, it's interesting because it's, whilst we are seeing an increasing kind of discourse, it's not without its problems. And this is kind of where I am sort of thinking about things from my own standpoint as an Afro-Indigenous person who is committed to sovereignty. Also, Afro-Indigenous refusal, which is like an idea that refuses the hierarchies of blackness that tend to separate black and African diasporic people in this place, but how important those politics of blackness have been to the formation of the settler colonial project in this place, which I think is a really thing that I have, like even the question with the word frustration, like that, I struggled with that word because even that has like an idea that there's some kind of resolution, there's some kind of final moment, there's some kind of solution or resolve that we're forward progressing towards, that we're going to achieve. So frustrations kind of was an, you know, a way for me to like sort of think about this recalibrating kind of notion that is like the perpetual theme in your work. So what I'm thinking about and through the work I'm committed to with blackfellas and Africans in this place is how you know, the history of this place has really been insistent on separating an analysis of blackness. So anti-black colonial logics are really important kind of organising infrastructures for how we understand what is actually happening in the political moment and the political call for sovereignty. And so I have kind of you know, started to, you know, I found it very interesting how you sort of brought this idea of white time, or you talk about the temporalities of race, because it's like part of this thing is dealing with the knowledge systems that bring us into an awareness of how we understand ourselves as racialised people in this place. And so as a person that's racialised as both African and First Nations, these kinds of racialised positions have been pitted against each other. And so the nuances of blackness here, like a lot of the time when we think about blackness, we transport a lot of the ideas and concepts from the US or the UK, but we have a really unique, nuanced working of racial blackness in this place, which is in direct relationship with the global black world, really, and blackfellas and people of African descent that have been in this place have been engaged in these kinds of relationalities in many different ways. And so what I really liked about this book, it kind of just gave a language to speak to some of those binary logics that we, you know, and when I talk about we, I'm talking about Africans and blackfellas, but also more broadly, you know, the racial kind of what was I calling it? The racial literacy, you know, and the need to advance a racial literacy from the nuances of this place and the people in this place and the types of constructions of blackness in this place that form the structures for settler colonialism to exist here. I really think that it has been a counterinsurgent project to keep our communities divided and divorced, because it's in the moments that you see our anti-colonial radical resistance that we present a very real threat to the establishment. So I'm interested in things like the black, you know, and it's Gary Foley. I really encourage everyone to go and jump on the Koori web, because he's got lots of essays on the Black Power movement. But it's Gary Foley that insists, like, to understand race and what happened here in the Aboriginal movement, we actually have to go back to the Black Power movement and understand the politics, the doctrine, the political philosophy, the key proponents, the people and the personalities. We need to return to those moments. And for me, as an Afro-Indigenous person, it is really interesting to see the way that, I mean, it makes total sense to me. Of course, blackfellas were over in Nigeria talking to Pan-Africanists, talking to people like Nkrumah and Du Bois, people like Ujuru Nunukul. She attended some of the first Pan-African conferences and was a part of the register and the language for developing a decolonial ethics here in this place. So with the increasing awareness of like decolonization, and we say all these kinds of key terms, and like they get co-opted, like you say, like we have these ideas of liberation, freedom, but they're always divorced from that lineage of the black radical tradition. And importantly, like Africans are, divorced from that. People will cite Frantz Fanon, but then have no engagement with the actual continent of Africa and the actual decolonial active movements that are happening right now. So in some of the work that I've done, I've gone back and looked at the way that our communities have been pitted up against each other, and particularly paid attention to like the rebellious Africans that got together with blackfellas to incite resistance and rebellion and disruption, ask other, like it helps us ask different questions to each other. But yeah, I think I'll talk more a bit later, but yeah, I think that deeply divided, like deeply connected but deeply divided, for me and my particular standpoint, has been a really important point of focus, and understanding like this is the tool, like the construction of blackness in this place is the tool that makes whiteness function here. The reason blackfellas were able to go to the continent of Africa and engage in African liberation movements is because it was understood that Pan-Africanism wasn't just a racialized thing. It was a world-making tool for the global majority. When they talked about black power, they were talking about 4/5 of the global human population, and that's the kind of that I think you talk about. I don't know if I'm translating the term properly, but I really liked your idea of like the counterinsurgent capture of indigeneity, and that's how I was kind of applying that idea and that notion to what's going on with like the complex nuances of blackness in this place, and why don't we have African studies departments in universities? Why don't we get to study the slave rebellions and how a lot of those convicts came and were sentenced to transportation here, and what types of other types of relations did they build in their connections with other rebellious blacks that were here resisting as well? So that's my frustration.
Alana, would you like to respond to that, or maybe talk about your own sort of political frustrations, for want of a better word? In the book, for example, you talk about how anti-racist DEI programs, and how those are also being sort of recalibrated by the racial regime for white supremacy, and also how the logics and language of indigenous sovereignty gets reappropriated by Zionist colonizers. So maybe you could also speak about that, or just respond to what the panel said. Yeah.
Sure. I think I have. Firstly, I mean, it's so wonderful to hear what both of you have to say. I think more importantly than the frustrations is actually about the kind of the radical thinking that inspires you in both of your work, and I want to reiterate how important this has been for my own kind of understanding of things. I really relate to this kind of division. So if we think with Robinson about what the purpose of race is, it's to differentiate, not to homogenize. He says this in Black Marxism. And we see this happening again and again. So this constant kind of move of racial rule to differentiate and to create this difference. And that then serves as a tactic of division that has very real political ramifications. And I don't think it's a mistake that we, in this place, know about race via the hegemonic US imperialist version of it, and rather than think of only, and I've written about this with Debbie Bargali, for example, rather than thinking only about, well, what's unique to this place, what we really need to be thinking about is how race is a project that's always relational and that's always global, because we don't get the traveling of race without imperialism, without colonialism, without slavery, that literally move people around to different locations and then obviously place them in juxtaposition with each other. But then what you have, and this is the racial regime at work, is this constant effort to divide them, even though we know that the common history exists. And, you know, Du Bois talks about this. He talks about the common history between people in Black Africa, the South Seas. I mean, he uses that language at the turn of the 20th century that we probably wouldn't use today, but he talks about this, and he talks about what he realizes on his travels to Africa, in particular, the similarities rather than the differences between the Black American experience that he's familiar with, that he in previous time thought he was unique, right? It's only after he travels and talks to people in other locations that he realizes how similar, in fact, those experiences are. And I think in terms of the frustrations, I mean, yes, you talked about things like DEI, or what Houria Boutelja, for example, talks about in the French context, but I think we all understand what she means. The difference between moral anti-racism and political anti-racism. So moral anti-racism is that kind of racism, it is a kind of, there you go, it's a Freudian statement, it's a kind of racism. The kind of anti-racism that says things like, we're better than this. Do you remember that slogan from when when there used to be a movement against mandatory detention that, by the way, nobody talks about anymore in this country, but the white liberals used to say, come on, Australia, we're better than this, right? So that kind of moral anti-racism, appealing to this idea that this is not who we really are. You know, I don't recognize Australians, when they do this kind of thing, and everybody else is looking at them going, but this is what this entire place is founded on. Like, what the hell are you talking about, right? But that kind of moral anti-racism, which pits itself against a political anti-racism, which, as Houria Boutelja and other people would talk about, it being absolutely at the core of how we even begin to think about what is the nation state within the context of the world historical processes that bring us racial capitalism, bring us imperialism, bring us colonialism, etc. We can't actually, as I said earlier, we can't take race out and place it over there. We can't have an anti-racist campaign, for example, against racial vilification, or against hate speech, or against even discrimination in the workplace, without associating all of those processes, all of those manifestations of racism, to the colonial edifice within which they cohere and which they exist in order to prop up, okay? And I think there's been a lot of investment, particularly here, and this is, again, a frustration, particularly in the realm of research, with isolating racism as a behavior of some rarefied individuals out from the entire, as I said before, colonial edifice. And of course, that's in order to be able to perpetuate business as usual. Put that together with the fact that Arnold Bloch-Leibler, also mentioned in the book, renamed its Reconciliation Action Plan the Indigenous Sovereignty Network. Okay, so this is very interesting. So we have this use of language that sounds radical. So we've got sovereignty, we've got self-determination, both being used by colonial institutions, and in Leibler's case, Zionists actively involved in the repression of not just, pro-Palestine and Palestinian activists, but everybody who stands with actual indigenous people through the language of indigeneity, right? Literally, not just the language, but through the practice of what they call reconciliation, but with this kind of knowing. And this is what places us in a very tenuous position, because knowingly repurposing the language of of our language in order to, really to install settler colonialism and embed it and make, particularly in the current conjuncture, Zionism mandatory, right? So mandatory Zionism, which is what we're seeing today, by which I spoke to the sociologist from Sydney University, Ihab Shalbak, about this, and he talked about the difference between compulsory Zionism, very interesting distinction between compulsory Zionism and mandatory Zionism. Compulsory Zionism, he says, is the more kind of soft kind, where you get it through, the culture and education and this kind of thing. So, for example, and I talk about this in the book, an organization like the Anti-Defamation League in the United States taking over anti-racism education to a great extent via the mechanism of hate speech, anti-hate speech legislation. So this kind of cosseting of everything that racism is all to do with this notion of hate, right? Which is, very, very, it's very deliberate, right? Because it really isolates this kind of the hateful out of, the entire edifice. So we've got this kind of thing. We've got the sort of the embeddedness of very particular repressive institutions that enter via our domains, right? So through anti-racism education, through the NGO sphere, through universities, as I've said before, and if you come back to Robinson's idea of chaos, right, and confusion, if the idea of the racial regime is to sow chaos and confusion, of course, that's what happens, because it's very difficult sometimes to actually discern. And I think if something that this current phase of the genocide has really laid bare are these kinds of processes. So more people are able to track it in real time. And I think that throws up a lot of questions in the air. But then I think we come back to your provocation, because what I read a little bit in what you said, Kaiya, forgive me if I'm wrong, but that there's a kind of an understanding almost in a theoretical in a sense about decolonization and resistance movements, and perhaps even a commitment to them in other locations, but a real failure to think about, well, what does it mean if I follow that thread all the way through? What does that mean for what I'm doing in this place, right? That house of cards has to fall down, including for myself as a settler on these lands. If I'm with the Palestinian resistance, what does that actually mean for Indigenous resistance here? How far am I going with that, right? How honest am I being, et cetera, et cetera? So I think it's good that we're being forced to ask these questions, but it is also quite easy within the structures that exist to kind of, just keep going with the little crumbs that are thrown to many of us in order to keep the status quo as it is. And of course, in Australia, I think we could talk about compulsory or mandatory multiculturalism as being very much the order of the day since the 1990s. And don't forget, it's John Howard, right, who brings that along, right? So in order very much to put pay to land back and so on. I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, okay. So I'm just going to connect to some of the things that has been said, and also respond to the question that I posed, because I kind of like answering my own questions. But I've also, like Keiran, been thinking about and troubled by liberal left politics, not just right-wing politics, but liberal left politics has really paved the way for many troubling recalibrations of the racial regime, right, that we're seeing today, right? So take DEI and affirmative action, for instance. These have become sites where Zionists have reconfigured anti-Semitism as Alana writes in the book, the most urgent form of racism, right? Refashioning themselves as exceptional minority subjects in order to suppress anti-colonial pro-Palestinian movements, right? So these causes of safety, trauma, and trigger warnings, they are being reformulated as psychosocial safety, right? Again, to silence pro-Palestinian solidarity and speech. So to connect what Kaiya said, there's so much of this capturing, right, of politics from the left, and the left has created so many opportunities for that to happen. And in many ways, agents of the racial regime have been very remarkably shameless in borrowing and retrofitting from the left for their own politics. Yet the left, and I know this is a controversial view, but safe space, the left is often mired in its own purity politics, right? Unable to grasp or seize tactics from the right. And here I'm thinking, for instance, okay, this is very controversial, the cultural productions of MAGA personalities like Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson, who ironically are the ones making the most scathing critiques of American imperialism at this moment, right? They are connecting the dots, they are revealing the operations from sort of Charlie Kirk's assassination to the suppression of the Epstein files. They are the ones tracking how the bourgeoisie capitalist class is entangled, even blackmailed by Mossad. I mean, it sounds like conspiracy theory, right? But you know, conspiracy theory is all that we have got in a world defined by Western epistemology, right? In a world entirely structured by Western epistemology, right? So conspiracy theory, gossip, rumor, they are all valid methodologies if we can stop being so moralistic about it, right? And the left is extremely moralistic. So, you know, if the right has sort of run with some of our tactics, is it possible for us, you know, to also take this and run with it? And I think we can, right? If we can be as shameless as they are, however counterintuitive it is to our left politics. I'm also not a radical activist like other members of the panel, but my classroom is my space of activism. And one of the political problems I face is, of course, the university, right? And Alana uses this quote in the book by Stuart Hall, right? Quote, "The university is a critical institution or it is nothing," right? The way universities have been so uncritical and so clearly on the wrong side of history in the face of an ongoing genocide tells us quite plainly that universities are nothing, right? But colonial institutions, thoroughly corporatized in the contemporary moment, completely evacuated of its public ethos. I get depressed thinking about it. And I actually feel it at the cold face, right? As a teacher, I see how substantive teaching, the kind that actually builds knowledge for politics, is not valued, right? Teachers, we are told to spend less time on teaching prep, focus on things that bring reputation and funds, right? But I actually take a lot of time doing teaching prep because I believe that substantive education matters, right? That knowledge has a material force. Right? But today's emphasis in pedagogy is all about technique and form, right? Every teaching award, and full confession, I've just submitted an application for a teaching award. But every teaching award is about how innovative have you been? What new technology have you used? How do you use AI responsibly, right? Well, by not using them in drones to execute people is how you use AI responsibly, right? So let's talk about those things substantively, right? Instead, teaching has become all form over substance, and the corporate university has been so ideologically uncritical and even anti-intellectual. But then, what does it mean to say that the university is nothing? Right? We live in an age where Mark Zuckerberg and other tech billionaires, they are poster boys for college dropouts, and they are socializing a new generation into believing that education is unimportant, only money, right? And in turn fostering yet another kind of anti-intellectualism that aligns with the corporate university, right? So yeah, I think we need to be very vigilant in our politics as well. Thanks for bearing me. I just wanted to answer the question that I posed to the panel.
Well done.
Yeah, and so as a final discussion question, I want to ask the panel, you know, what kinds of methodologies might we turn to guard against these pitfalls, you know, and recalibrations that we speak about, that Alana writes about.
Okay.
Sorry, what was the question again?
What kinds of methodologies, right, in your activism, or what kind of practices in your activism that helps you to guard against these pitfalls, frustrations?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think, and like not to throw any shade on the academics on the panel, But at the end of the day, like when we look at quite a lot of theory and praxis in organising spaces, it still exists within the confines of Eurocentric ideologies and epistemologies and ontologies and like ways of understanding the world and viewing the world and what we define as progress and what we define as modernity and all of these other sort of things. And the academic institutes obviously aren't exceptions here. They're very much a part of that as well. They uphold a very Eurocentric outlook of the world and way of viewing the world and relating to it. So like for me and for like a lot of the organising I do, we try and incorporate Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous culture into what we're doing and the way that we understand the world so that we can imagine it a lot differently. A really great author who I'm reading lately who actually talks a lot about this is a guy named Lwazi Lashaba. He's a South African, a black person from South Africa. He talks a lot about how liberalism is very entwined with a lot of your Marxist and revolutionary struggles around the world in the way that, and hang on, I gotta make sure I word this correctly because like I don't want to like discredit anything. There's a lot of gains that have been won around the world with a lot of revolutionary struggles, but when we actually look at them, for the most part, quite a lot of them still exist within that Eurocentric outlook of the world and how we define progress and modernity and development and all these sort of things. And he really tries to articulate that and how we move past that, how we understand the world in a way that's not based in liberalism and not based in Eurocentricities. So yeah, I try and incorporate that into a lot of the organising I do, and just the way that we understand the situation that we're in as well, because quite a lot of it is I bang on about liberalism so much, but it's because it's probably the most important thing at the moment in terms of like our obstacles. But like so much of it is just everywhere in every space, and in every organising committee and in all of our different protest movements, and it's just so intrinsic in everything that's happening. And it's something that really needs to be combated and really needs to be recognised as well to be able to combat it. So, I suppose like that's something I try and incorporate a lot. Just looking at the way that, we define our struggle and, is that defining struggle still through a Eurocentric lens or still within the spectrum of liberalism, and trying to move beyond that. I suppose that's probably like the best way to explain it.
I really agree with what you're saying. And a lot of what I have, like the way I have thought about this in the approach of like questioning, like what is my function in the university as a black scholar? What is my purpose here? What is my aim? And that is service to the communities of which I hold obligations and responsibilities to. And so my investments are twofold, and part of that process is situated outside of the colonial institution of the academy. And so if I'm writing and thinking about the ways in which Africans and black scholars have been brought together through imperialism and colonialism and the social conditions that are produced through our racialization and the social relations that shape the way we move in the world and understand what it means to be a human in this world, I have to do a couple of things. One of those, and this is not new, like you said, knowledge is not new, knowledge is relational, knowledge all comes from somewhere else. And this is where, I've started with, okay, so we understand that the colonial institution is one of the technologies of white supremacy. Knowledge and the war on, the epistemological project, the way we come to understand knowledge has been a really important tool in our exploitation. This is something that was identified by our ancestors a long time ago when they first declared war. And I'm reminded of constantly about when Africans and Indigenous people all over the world started to mobilise on the ground in practice, not just in theory. When they were starting to do that project, they understood the epistemological project as urgent and necessary. just as urgent and necessary as the political project of sovereignty. And I think you talk about this in Cedric Robinson's idea of culture. The first attack is the attack on culture. And so when we look at how, Indigenous people to the continent of Africa in their decolonial struggles, when they started to mobilise, the first thing they had to do is to get people to understand that we were brothers and sisters, and to divorce ourselves from the Eurocentric ideologies that have, shaped our social relations and our disconnections and all of the other kinds of manifestations of that. So that is one part of the project, but that can't be the only part of our project. For me, we've got this, we talk about these decolonial futures, but we also have 5 centuries of internalized colonization. And we have a lot of, within the complexity of like deep pain and deep trauma, there is also deep beauty and deep complexity in the pain of that trauma. We are people that went through incredible duress, but we still created sanctuary in those conditions. And so within those kinds of pockets and the complexities of that, we find new types of epistemologies, we find new ways of world making, we find different ways to, and you talk about this as the new, you talk about Cedric Robinson's idea of new histories and the importance of, having like the two projects working together. So I think part of why it's been important for me to go back into the colonial record, look at how has the colonial archive depicted and constructed blacks in this place in order to enact the settler colonial project here. One of the ways, and I'm going back to the academy now, but what happens in it, I think Patrick Wolfe is a really important Australian settler colonial theorist, because he dominates the way we have taken on the idea of settler colonial, the specific kind of constitutive elements of settler colonialism here. They originate in Australia and they're kind of used all over the world in settler colonial studies, which is interesting, right? Which tells us something really important about race and racial blackness and the nuances and the uniqueness of what's happening here. But what he says in one of his theories is, blackness, and I always speak from my own standpoint. I'm only speaking from the African and the Indigenous intersection. But what he says is, African blackness, that's about labour, and Indigenous blackness, that's about land and territory. And that has been the debate that has set up the way we have understood our race relations. It has structured our fights about, the social conditions of our material realities in our communities, who gets access to what fund, whether we're included in the curriculum or whether we can access things, or how come you're not coming to the marches, or how come you're, all of these kinds of internalized debates that we have amongst ourselves in our communities really have forced me to think there's really two things that need to happen from my standpoint and from what I'm thinking about this thing. And I really, really believe that, just as much as we have technologies of white supremacy, we have ancestral technologies too. They've always been there. We've always turned to them, and we've always created other possibilities and other epistemologies that don't centre colonialism, imperialism. That isn't the starting point of the way in which we understand the world around us. And from that place we can ask new questions of each other. So one of the questions I'm increasingly concerned with is this idea of how do we speak about sovereignty to each other in different kinds of metrics as black people, and what are we doing within the context of just our relational, intimate lives, within our own families, within our child rearing practices, within the way that we relate to, the kin and community around us, and then, et cetera, et cetera. So, I think it is a deeply personal political imperative as well. It's not just, a political project. It's also, a world-making project of new possibilities, and that work, this is what I love about, being black, is like there's just such a rich archive of ancestral technology where they have given us tools for that. So like I really liked how you talked about like time, because whilst the colonial archive was busy, putting an understanding of our relations in a linear structure, we had, other forms of understanding time. We had, this way, I talk about it from this idea of Sankofa, which is an Indigenous term to West African, to the Ashanti peoples of where I come from. But it's an idea that basically is very similar to the idea of like the concept of the every when or the dreaming. That's probably not the right kind of terminology for it, but we have these concepts that sit outside of the Western understanding, but it's like the past, present, and the future are connected. And we have capacity to, access other dimensions and other ways to be and think in the world and relate to each other that are beyond just the human moment as well. They are planetary dimensions. There are, many different ways that we can, find and create new possibilities to restructure the way we want to reclaim and build strategy for our collective remembering, for our collective rewriting, for our collective memory work or reclamation work, in a way that helps us really like interrogate these ideas of like democracy, liberty. Like we have our own ways, our ancestors have our own terms and ways to do that. So yeah, I just think, that's what I think. Sorry.
Yeah, well, just briefly, I mean, it's so wonderful to hear you say all of these things, because this is what I think, if you really listen to the Black radical tradition, this is what it's saying. And these ceaseless debates, and I just read a paper the other day by Cedric Johnson, who's I guess, Black American, I don't know if he's a political scientist, a political theorist, who's angry with Cedric Robinson because he blames him for kind of essentializing blackness and for disregarding black Marxism or African Marxism in the real sense of the word. He would see it as differently to how Robinson talks about black Marxism in that book. And these debates keep coming up. And there's this notion that if you talk about the rich ancestral knowledges and ways of knowing, being, and doing that, and Robinson insists on this, we're not lost. He insists in black Marxism in saying that there's no such thing as the knowledge required to resist enslavement suddenly becoming a realization at the point of enslavement. So Africans, for example, who were stolen and taken on ships, who decided to jump overboard, they were doing that based on a cultural resource that they already had, that they were not going to be taken into captivity and they were not going to be taken into slavery. So it wasn't only after the experience of enslavement, there was already a resource there that could be used in the same way that there was that resource that led enslaved people to become fugitives and to construct communities and to help other people to escape enslavement. The amazing stories of people who despite everything did what they could to resist their conditions. This was not something that only was realized in through that experience. And I think that's actually a universal story. But I think what Western, the Western order and its epistemologies have done so successfully is to cut us off all from those knowledges and those practices that we need in order to save humanity, because with the state of the planet and with this atmosphere of fascism, which, as George Jackson reminds us, is not recurring, it's not, or neither is it new. It's something that certain people have always experienced under this order. It's just that we see it more nakedly when it, emerges in a more kind of visceral sense, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't there. With all of this, we need to be able to tap into something in order to be able to save all of our existence. I mean, this is the reality, but such a good job has been done on us all that we are severed from those knowledges. And if I take to position myself now, and I tried to deal with this in a recent few things that I've written. I mean, you talked, Shawna, there about how I speak in the 5th chapter about how Jewish safety, this idea of Jewish safety, is used almost as a proxy for Western man, Western Homo Europaeus, to save himself from the barbarians at the gates, right? And not actual Jewish people, but the idea of the Jew that has always served as a repository for European kind of shielding is put to the fore with the full participation of Zionists, who are, of course, primarily anti-Semites in all its dimensions, in order to save Western civilization from the Great Replacement, right? And this is the condition that we're in. But the inability for many of us Western white Jews to actually have a repository of deep knowledges to tap into because of the success with which we've been folded into an idea of Westernness and white supremacy via Zionism is so extreme that there's almost nothing to hang on to, like there's almost nothing to do. And then that leads to questions about what are Jews today? I mean, and it's a very, very significant question that I think many anti-Zionists are asking themselves, and the questions are very fertile. I mean, is there anything that we can relate to anymore? Because Zionism, white supremacy, and imperialism has done such a job on us, right? Mm-hmm. And where then can we look for a way out of all of this? So that's not a very happy note to end on, but that's kind of where. So I'm thinking with the methodologies that I look to are the methodologies of the Black radical tradition, and to try to make connections there.
Yeah, I might be able to offer just one quick happy ending, maybe. Okay, so I think one methodology to navigate our current time is really the Palestinian movement, and how it's giving us sort of an anti-imperialist praxis and methodology that is broader and more radical than BDS, right? So we've got a whole new generation of young people occupying universities and arms factories, making very radical demands, right? The Palestinian movement is also more radical in its anti-military critique, which used to be about the whiteness of the military or the white saviorism of the military, right? But now the demands are for complete disarmament, right, by nation states. Right? The Palestinian movement is also internationalist. We've got millions and millions of people around the world protesting on the streets. Right? So this constellation of events is ripe for revolution in Gramsci's terms. Right? But then it's maybe this is the sad ending ultimately. It is all very unjust, right? Because Palestinians, they are losing land, lives, and limbs every day, and they are still giving. In this kind of racialized fungibility, right? Fungibility is this term from Black studies where the black body is continuously made into some kind of property and use value for others without reciprocity, right? So we owe Palestinians an incalculable debt for showing us how Western imperialism works. They are teaching us, they are bearing the full costs to the extent that we are all part of this system, with the most negatively racialized among us facing the full depravity of Western imperialism. To that extent, we are all Palestinians. So I just, as a final note, do we have time for Q&A?
Do you want to make some Q&A?
Yeah, maybe 10, 15 minutes. Yeah. Questions, comments?
Do you want to use the microphone? Does anybody have any questions? Oh, yeah. Ross, can you use the...
Keiran, you spoke about liberalism a lot. And obviously here we've seen a re-emergence or revisualization of fascism recently. And often we see or hear about these things as like different ideologies. And I wondered maybe if you wanted to speak to the connection between them.
So a lot of people try and look at liberalism as being separate from fascism or separate from Marxism. But the reality is liberalism's a spectrum with fascism on one end and Marxism on the other end. They all exist within this same liberal spectrum. Now, you know, we have what appears to be a rise in the far right currently here in the colony. And, you know, a lot of people falsely identify what that actually is. At the end of the day, you know, this has always been a fascist occupation. You know, it has been since 1788. And it was liberalism that was the guiding ideology that justified the colonisation of Australia. You know, these two things go hand in hand together. You know, liberalism is what gave people the consent to come here and take our land and to civilise us, or, you know, whatever else they decided to do along the way, you know, exterminate us and assimilate us and blah, blah, blah. But it's always been fascism, the way it's played out. You know, fascism is just a way of enacting liberal ideology and liberal, you know, politics, I suppose, for lack of a better term. But yeah, they're very much tied together. And, you know, you can't separate the two. It's like that whole saying about, you know, scratch a liberal and a fascist bleeds. Like, it's true, though. No, it is very much true. And, you know, likewise, like, you know, I hate to say it, but Marxists are liberals as well. They exist on that same spectrum. You know, even you go back and you read Karl Marx's text, and he's just paraphrasing John Locke, who was the father of liberalism. Now, when he talks about, you know, if I mix some blood and sweat with the soil, it's my means of production now. Well, that's all well and great, but what about the Indigenous people whose land that it's on? What about the Indigenous people whose resources they are? You know what I mean? So yeah, they're very tied in together, and I think that people need to accept that and start to like recognise that in order to be able to confront it. And just real quickly, I know this is a bit off topic, but I just want to say it anyways. Just what I was saying at the start about like the rise in the far right at the moment. You know, there's no rise in the far right at the moment. You know what I mean? Like, we've got a couple of dozen disillusioned, for the most part, white teenagers who are in these organisations like the NSN and stuff. But the far right has always been prevalent here. You know, Labor's the far right party at the end of the day. You look at the mass incarceration rates here. Look at the White Australian policy that the Labor Party backed. Look at our child removal rates today, and, you know, all of these other things. These are all earmarks of fascism, no matter how you define it. And it's been something that has been very much ongoing ever since 1788.
Yes.
Anyone else?
I have a question for Keiran. That's okay. Yes. Do you do like political education with like kids in your work? Like, or what? Like, what does political education with Bob look like?
Not currently, but I have before. So I've worked in a range of different NGOs and not-for-profits and other Aboriginal organisations like residential rehabs and juvenile justice programs and Aboriginal healthcare centres and all that sort of stuff. I never last long there for obvious reasons, but when I'm there, I always do try and incorporate like a bit of a political education to the people that I'm working with. Currently, I don't do anything with kids. That being said, the BPU, something that we done really great when we first kicked off was political education classes, which are open to the public to come along to. Not necessarily kids, but just generally. Yeah. And we're kicking them back off again as soon as I just call a date for the first one. So they'll be running every month, and hopefully some kids come along to that. We do a lot of stuff actually at like Camp Sovereignty. Follow the BPU on Instagram and Facebook, and we'll announce it on there. But we do a lot of stuff like, actually, no, that's a lie. We do some stuff with kids. So like we have a lot of kids and a lot of youth come into spaces like Camp Sovereignty that I mentioned before down in Melbourne, where we do a lot of either one-on-one or like one on a group. It's not necessarily like a structured education per se, but we're always down there trying to educate people and, you know, just talking about what the issues are, what needs to happen, and, you know, how we combat stuff, and et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, something that I do want to get more into. Not to steal your thunder, Alana, but I'm writing a book.
Yeah. This is going to be the book to read. Yeah, absolutely. Watch the space. We're looking forward.
I asked the question because I was thinking, and I think Nellie and I and just the girl that was there before, we were having a conversation outside about like the postcode wars and all of this. But just to bring it, like you mentioned, you know, the indications of like a fascist society and the over incarceration and the war on black kids in this country has been like one of the important tools of white supremacy and the racial regime here. And I noticed like the political consciousness of young people who are at the front and centre of the war, whose bodies are, you know, on the line in many different ways. The suppression of like political consciousness is really interesting and how that's like emerging. And it just, to bring it back to this place, like where we're sitting right now, like these streets, Marrickville, Inner West, Inner City, Sydney, Glebe, like the surrounding Redfern, like these are the black radical traditions that are really important to, you know, the young people of these communities, and that the recalibration of race and the war on black kids in these places, you know, it's just really prominent to me, like just when you were saying that, and I was thinking like the kids that are sitting in cages are given TVs, they're given Nintendos to keep them disconnected from any critical consciousness. So like I just thought like it was important to sort of place an end in that and placing our, like bringing it back to that thing, like our political analysis has to be nuanced to here, to mob here, like where the room we're sitting in, the streets, and like the stories and the epistemologies of these places are really fruitful and rich, and like speak into like these broader kind of global historical processes, but the erasure and the invisibility of those is like, yeah, it was just kind of, I wanted to say that.
Yeah, no, and I think you brought it up earlier as well, but something as well that like along those same sort of lines that I've noticed is the whole sort of like importing of, especially from America, but like Western culture in regards to, you know, how we define black people. You know, so many of our youth are caught up in, you know, what they define as a black person from America, which is just what the mass media over there defines a black person is, which is, you know, some poor person from the ghetto who's involved with like, you know, turf wars with each other and, you know, postcode wars and all this sort of stuff. And it's, you know, we have so many of our youth who are like caught up in this because they're so hungry for, you know, identity and culture and guidance and stuff, and they're just looking, and what they see is these black faces on the TV doing X, Y, Z, and they think, all right, well, you know, that's what we need to do. But that's because that's what the media is giving them. You know what I mean? The media is not there talking about like the history of black resistance. The media is not talking about, you know, like the way that we have all these, you know, great diverse cultures and, you know, great diverse history of struggle and whatever else and stuff. So people, a lot of our youth do get caught up in that, unfortunately, which is, something I don't know how to tackle that apart from like rigorous education, but like, I don't know.
Yeah, no, like I was thinking about it as like, are these like the new like resistance, like this, you know, the ways in which, and not to like valorize violence, but like it comes back to some of these core ideas of concerning violence. Like we are seeing and witnessing a response from young black bodies that are on the front line to the point where they're turning to violence. And, you know, that just kind of is an important provocation to like ground ourselves in the realities that are like right in these streets, like literally outside. So, you know, these aren't like far away, distant like problems. But I just
100%.
Any final question?
Oh, somebody at the back.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just a question for Alana. I totally get what you're talking about with taking inspiration from black radical traditions as a Jew. And you know, you would know a lot more about this than me, but I'm just curious because as I understand it, Zionism amongst Jews kind of began as a secular, like Herzl famously was secular, and had a lot of opposition from rabbis and religious Jews at the time. There was a very strong anti-Zionist Jewish sort of movement at that time. Do you think there's anything there, from a Jewish identity point of view to go back to? Because that tradition's obviously always been there. It hasn't been dominant, but is that something that do you think is of value for Jews, or is it have to look elsewhere?
No, I do think it's of value, and I do think that there are many, people around the world and growing numbers of younger Jews who are anti-Zionist. But I do think that there's a problem that needs to be spoken about, and that is the search for a reconstitution of let's say, a way to be Jewish ethically via the Palestinian struggle. And I think that's a massive problem that Palestinians are identifying, and we have to sit with the discomfort that might elicit, that for many anti-Zionist Jews, this current genocide has become a mechanism for us to save ourselves. And I don't think that is the route that we should be taking. I think that's it's very narcissistic. And because whether we like it or not, and we can talk about, and I am somebody who says that Judaism and Zionism are not the same thing and they need to be distinguished from each other, but whether we like it or not only is this genocide being perpetrated in our name, even though really it's in the name of Western imperialism, but what I'm saying is that Jews are being put as the face of Western imperialism, which is very dangerous, but also the vast majority, sadly, of Jewish institutions in the West are fully on board with it. So that is something that, whether or not I don't feel represented by any of those institutions, but that I can say that until the cows come home. Bibi Netanyahu still think he speaks for me. He says I speak for all the Jews in the world. So that is a problem that I have to contend with, and I think it's too easy for us to jump over the difficult part, if you know what I mean. But yes, there are repositories. I mean, of course, Judaism is millennia old. Zionism is 100 years old. So. Zionism is much older, actually, but goes back to the 18th and even to the 18th century as a Christian movement, but without opening all of that. But as a Jewish movement, because I think it's late. But yeah, we need to sit with the discomfort and really think about what that means, I think.
Right. On that note, we'll bring this to a close, and I just want to thank Alana again for writing this sort of live and living archive of how the racial regime works. Because in instructing us, right, this book isn't just an academic book; it is a methodology for action. So, thank you for that. Yeah.
Thank you. Can I say something?
Yes. There will be books for sale and book signing at the back there.
Yeah, so we're going to do some book signing out the front.